Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder as I step out for a walk and deliver an episode to you while I stroll around. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good morning, listeners. It's a lovely day here in suburban Chicago. The sun is it's up a little bit, but it's relatively dark because we're overcast today. So I guess when I said lovely day, I meant temperature-wise, not weather-wise. It looks like it's going to rain. Hopefully it won't rain on me while I'm walking, talking to you. But it could. Definitely could. So I thought I would come out today and talk to you a little bit about games. I will confess that I feel pretty proud of myself keeping to 3 episodes a week over the summer. Sometimes in the summer I slack off a little bit, but because I got behind in my normal production schedule, I really need to hit 3 episodes a week for most of the year in order to get caught up. Normally by June, I should be about episode 50 of the current season. Instead, we're mid-July, and this is episode 40 of the current season. So I'm making up good time, but I'm gonna have to keep up this pace if I wanna get back on the idea that I finish a season around mid to late December. In order to maintain that schedule, I'm gonna have to keep on trucking. So I was looking through the available information about this, about what I might do an episode of. My regular segments all seem a little like I've done them too recently. I try to spread them out a little bit, so I'm not doing the same thing all the time. It's not time for another literature review. It's not time for a 400 back. I did one of those 10 or 15 episodes ago. Like, I try to keep them spread out a little bit so that nothing gets too repetitive. But that means I didn't have a specific thing to do today, and I didn't have a topic that came to mind, but needs must. And so, this is funny, I just Googled the number 640. This is episode 640 of the podcast, so I Googled 640 just to see what would come up. Well, one thing, first I Googled the significance of the number 640, and I found out about something called angel numbers. Apparently in some spaces in spiritual communities, people believe that specific numbers represent messages from God or supernatural entities or whatever, and somehow the number 640 fits that category. I'm not really sure why, and I did not read too much into it. Not really my bag, but I guess this episode is significant in that way. If it is for you, hello, welcome. But then I just Googled the number 640 by itself, and I thought I would reflect on what if the first 5 results after you get rid of the ads in the Google search for 640 were significant to board games. And here's what we have. So to start with, we have KFI AM 640 talk radio. Now I looked this up. I was a little worried that it would be the sort of hard-charging right-wing left talk radio of the sort like Newt Gingrich kind of, or Rush Limbaugh style radio, but it doesn't seem to be, but it's unclear what it is to me. They don't have an about section. Their webpage is pretty rudimentary, so I'm not really sure what it is. I think it's in Los Angeles over the air, and I did not take the time to listen on the iHeartRadio app, so I don't know if KFI AM 640 talk radio is a good station or a bad station or ideologically aligned with me or ideologically opposed to me. I don't know anything about it, but I do know it's about a radio, and I was thinking, I don't know if there's any board games about radio station, and it seems to me that is an interesting subject to make a board game about if you were somebody who was so inclined. There's a really interesting idea of trying to run a radio station, and I guess you'd probably have to have 2 versions of the game. You'd have a talk radio game and a music radio game. The music one seems most interesting because you could have elements of sort of choosing your genre and dealing with marketers and trying to get advertising for your station and trying to pick up audience share. Probably I don't know if the game is more interesting if everybody has the same kind of radio station or if you're competing for the market but you have different kinds of radio station. But it seems like because middle management is such a fruitful space for interesting Euro games, it seems like running a radio station could make for a really interesting game premise if somebody were so inclined. I can see how that'd be really interesting. I might even enjoy playing such a game. I don't know that I would want to put in the work to make a game, so I guess I'm offering this idea out to somebody. If you were inclined to make a game about radio stations, there's a theme I haven't seen before. In looking at Board Game Geek, I discovered that there, at least with the word radio as the main word, there don't seem to be a lot of games about radios, or perhaps any. So that's interesting to me, that radio station does not seem to be a genre that people are making games about. Of course, you might call it a dying medium because people are listening over the internet, but I feel like radio stations are still in business, that it is a thing people still enjoy, even if the delivery method has changed a bit. So, KFI AM 640 radio. Doesn't seem to have a lot of overlap with board games, but I'd be interested to hear how it might. The next result in Google was the 640 area code. 640 area code covers parts of New Jersey, Trenton, Atlantic City, and Pleasantville, which of course made me think of what board games have to do with Atlantic City. Of course, perhaps the most famous board game there is, Monopoly, is about Atlantic City, right? That you are buying and selling properties, and the street names are all Atlantic City streets. The idea is that I guess you're buying and selling Atlantic City. There's also the famed Kickstarter that was sort of a parody or an anti-Monopoly game called The Doom That Came to Atlantic City. This is a famous early Kickstarter that went badly and caused all kinds of trouble. I don't know anyone who's played the game, but it's a great title, The Doom That Came to Atlantic City. And I think it was a sort of Lovecraftian take on Monopoly. So yeah, Atlantic City is deeply tied to board games. I don't know much about Trenton as a city, but I do know Pleasantville, only because I don't actually know Pleasantville. I know the movie Pleasantville, which was a movie from the late 90s in which Tobey Maguire plays a goody two-shoes character who his favorite thing is this 1950s sitcom, sort of Leave It to Beaver style family drama or family comedy called Pleasantville. And he sits down for a marathon of the game, and he and his sister are accidentally teleported into the game, and their modern views disrupt all of Pleasantville. The movie had its gimmick, which actually works really well, was that once people become sort of liberated from the closed mind of the Pleasantville space, they actually turn color. The whole the TV show's part is in black and white. So as people become liberated, they turn color, which is a pretty cool effect. That's the movie Pleasantville. The game that seems most tied into that particular perspective is Welcome To, which feels like it's playing on 1950s Americana in its style and what it's building. Despite having a female architect on the cover of the game, I think it's still trading in that nostalgia. But it does make me wonder what else is going on. What other places do we see this sort of aesthetic that we could use? I mean, I think the other one I can, off the top of my head, that feels like it's trading in 1950s, 1960s Americana is Food Chain Magnate, which the art style has that kind of 1950s style to it. At least the original one. I haven't seen the deluxe upgrade that they did the Kickstarter for. But other than Welcome To, the other game that I know of that takes place in New Jersey, or feels connected to New Jersey, is Cape May, which sounds like a really good game. The reviews of it that I've read enjoyed it quite a bit. I haven't played it myself. It is from Thunderworks Games, and I've generally found that their games are pretty good. Although I didn't like Role Player as much as I like Sagrada. I feel like Sagrada is a better implementation of that kind of mechanism. I do like Cartographers quite a bit. But it seems like the 640 area code is a lush place for board gamers and board game designers. And if you feel like playing something in that area code, you could play Monopoly, you could play Cape May, or with a little bit of semantic drift, you could play Welcome To. The next result on the Google search for 640 was 640 credit score. Is it good? I did not click through to the page, although the little summary that was provided underneath the title of the page said 640 credit score is fair. It's not good, not bad, it's fair. So right in the middle, I guess. But I was thinking about, as you think about credit scores, there's a couple games that come to mind as something you could play if you're thinking about that side of things. One, from a finance side, I always hear how good Stockpile is, though that's a stock trading game more than a game about credit or credit scores or economics more broadly. The second game, if you're thinking about credit score as a way of rating people's quality or people's level of achievement in terms of finance, then credit score would be tied very directly to your other people's opinion of you, which means high society is probably your go-to there. As a reminder, high society is an auction game where each player has a set amount of money and you bid on works of art and other things. And the idea is that you want to have the best stuff at the end of the game, the stuff that's worth the most points. However, right before we determine who has the best stuff, first we look at who has the least amount of money left. And if you've spent more money than anybody else, so you have the least amount of money left, then you're out of the game because you spent too much money, which is a really great twist because you're constantly trying to figure out if you can spend something or if you have to hold back so that you don't get put on the bottom of the stack. The third game that I would point to, if we're playing a game about money and credit, would be QE. QE stands for quantitative easing. It is the process of, I believe, a government printing more money in order to solve a problem. The game is an auction game, but everyone bids on things in secret, and at the end of the game you have to have the most points based on companies, but again, you lose if you spend the most money. Because the bidding is all almost entirely secret, as the game goes along, the amounts that people are spending on their bids rise dramatically, and it ends up being very funny. Quantitative easing, or QE, is a really delightful game. It plays relatively short. There's a great reveal at the end as people tally up how much they spent, and it's very enjoyable. But again, it's sort of about credit, or feels connected anyway to the credit score of 640. All right, next up, the next result on the thing, sort of like radio station, was a business. This was 640 Meats. I did not follow through to the thing about the butcher shop. I just saw that it was a butcher shop. So I didn't look where it was, and I did not know why. I did not inquire why it's called 640 Meats. Feels like one reason you might call it that is if it's at 640, that's the address, 640 Junction Street or whatever. Junction Street is a hilarious street name, I think. Intersection Street would be funny too. I'll meet you at the intersection of Junction and Intersection. Anyway, 640 Meats is a butcher shop where they sell different kinds of meat, obviously. It leads to the obvious and interesting question of what kinds of butcher shop related things are there in games. Now, of course, getting meat from animals is a key part of lots of games. Agricola certainly has professions where if you're a butcher, you can get more food out of your animals than if you're not. I'm always reminded of my favorite rule in Dungeon Pets that helps with the management of the meat in that game. And if a creature ages out, it is sent to live on a farm, and you, in a completely unrelated rule, add one meat to the meat market. I think that's always very funny. So there are games that involve butchering, or butchers is a regular part of any kind of game that involves farming. Converting animals into meat is a thing that you do. Sometimes the animals themselves are just meat. It also occurs to me that a lot of times the symbol for food in games is a little meat, like a little drumstick, which I think is kind of funny. It's often a bag of grain too. Those are the two most common symbols. The weirdest one is the game Mosaic, in which the symbol for food is either wheat or a fish. And I think a fish represents 3 wheat. Like they're the same currency, but the fish token is a 3. Very confusing. Nonetheless, I was also thinking about what would a game involving a butcher shop be like. Of course, there would be a customer service element. There would be a keeping stock element. Probably the keeping stock would be the most interesting because you have to buy animal stock. And if the game had worked in an amount of time that takes to go from buying an animal to having product to sell, then you have to manage the flow of that. And of course, adding more employees would help you do that faster, but it would cost you more. It feels like the management of a butcher shop is an interesting, if you're gonna have a game sort of simulating retail, management of a butcher shop is an interesting one because the product that you produce has to be prepared, as opposed to, managing a grocery store would be interesting still. You have to order the food, I guess, but the preparation is just putting it out. Whereas in the butcher shop, you'd have to order the food, so to speak, and then you actually have to prepare it by butchering it and then getting it ready. So it feels like 640 Meats could inspire an interesting board game. And there's already a lot of butchering, that sort of thing in games already. Finally, the fifth result in my search of 640 is the year 640. Wikipedia has a page called Year 640 DCXL, which is there, which sounds like an expansion to the DC deck builder, where all the heroes are the giant heroes, DCXL, or maybe it's the DC deck builder, but the cards are tarot sized, something like that. Anyway, as a year, pretty boring, honestly. If you read the summary of what's going on, there's a handful of entries for each continent, but mostly different wars that had happened and or changes of political leadership, kings deposing other kings, that sort of thing. It's just a matter of not a lot of history was recorded during that time. Nonetheless, the two things I thought were most interesting, some ice cores in Switzerland have shown that there's a lot more silver detritus in the air in that area, meaning silver mining had picked up, or it signaled a return of economic prosperity that we hadn't seen in close to 100 years, which does lead me to think of Kutna Hora, which is a game from CGE that came out last year, and it was about silver mining. Now, I don't know if it was set anywhere near the time of 640. That seems unreasonably early. Nonetheless, interesting. The other thing that struck me as potentially game interesting is the death of Abbot Wynnock. Wynnock was a Welsh saint who was an abbot and did a bunch of other stuff, but one of the main things Wynnock did was to run a granary, and apparently the big miracle that he accomplished was when he was older, he lived by himself and was constantly grinding grain for the peasants, even though he was too old to properly operate the mill. And no one could understand how he did it, and it turned out it was turning by itself. Magic or something, I don't know. That was one of the great things. He also, apparently someone went to investigate how it was that he was doing it, and they were struck blind, and then he cured them. So, interesting set of things related to Abbot Wynnock, which make for perhaps an interesting character you might make a game out of. I don't know how you make a game out of that, but interesting nonetheless. Well, that brings me to the end of my board game meditation on the year 640. Well, I hope you found that interesting. I always like to look at different things through a single set of lenses. So like looking at the world through the number 640 and seeing what you find. I think there's a valuable and interest to be found there, which is why I am publishing this episode. Did you like it? Did you hate it? Do you want to hear something like this again? Do you never want to hear something like this again? Head over to Board Game Geek Guild 3269 and shout out. Otherwise, thanks for joining me on my walk today. I hope your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.